Are we filming? Yes, we are. So, my neighbour had an acquaintance who helped contribute to the downfall of Napoleon. Let me explain. But before I do, let me take you back to my school days, over 50 years ago, to a couple of things. We were taught this phrase, this well-known phrase, able was I ere I saw Elba, which can be written backwards and it says exactly the same thing. Able was I ere I saw Elba, and it refers to the abdication and subsequent removal of Napoleon to eke out his days under supervision on the remote island of Elba. But I also remember, and this is relevant to this story, it was a picture in a book, a library book. I can't remember whether it was a Ladybird book or some other book, but I always remember this picture of a press gang in presumably some town next to the coast in the UK. A press gang chasing and catching a local lad, probably about 12, 13, 14, 15. And these press gangs pressed effectively conscripts. They seized by force young lads who would then subsequently be forced to serve in the English Navy. And Napoleon had a similar idea. We're talking about the Napoleonic Wars, where Britain was at war with France over 200 years ago. And there was in France there was a decree or a law. I'm not quite sure how it's termed, but the point of this law or decree was to make it legal for Napoleon to conscript, initially at least, 60,000 young men into his army. And over the years, as things became a little bit more desperate in the Napoleonic Wars, that increased to the point where in 2013, I believe, that the requirement was 300,000 men, and it became unsustainable. There was a certain number each year. In fact, in 1813, the quota, if you like, for 2014 was brought forward because they simply couldn't find enough conscripts. And this was an important thing. It was, in the later years of the Napoleonic Wars, the biggest problem, getting enough guys to join the army. And there was a lot of attrition here over the course of the Napoleonic Wars. There were 1 million conscripts who, half of them died, and the rest were that they deserted or they went missing in some way. So there was a huge attritional loss. And it wasn't just in France. And here's the thing, this is where the story begins, because the conscription also occurred in Germany and Italy. And this is where my story begins, I guess. So there is this woodcutter. Imagine this woodcutter in northern Italy, cutting his wood as a young man, and he would have to be a young man because conscription generally applied to those men under 25, largely single, although marriage didn't exclude you specifically, and it was largely confined to poor working men, because if you were wealthy, you could purchase a replacement, so you didn't have to be conscripted. And it was run by ballot in each department, a bit like an English county, I suppose. And so the head honcho in each department had to come up with a certain number of conscripts in his manor, and it was done by lottery. And if your number came up, well, there was a good chance you were never going to see your family again. You know, quite serious, really. And the number of deserters was very, very high, very, very high, and you can understand that, obviously. So this woodcutter, he's in his wood, cutting the wood, and I don't know the full details of the circumstances, but I do know one pertinent thing that has come to me through the decades, through the centuries, over 200 years, and that is that he evaded conscription by hiding inside his woodpile. I mean, fantastic, absolutely fantastic. So how do I know this? How do I know that this actually happened? It's all down to my neighbour. Back in the early 80s, my next door neighbour and her daughter lived together, and although I never ever spoke to the mother, apparently she never learnt English. She only spoke Italian. But I saw her very occasionally standing at the window looking at me, and I looked back. But I never spoke to her. But she was very, very old. I don't know how old, but I'm guessing perhaps approaching 100. And her daughter regaled to me this story once when she popped round to feed the cats, and I listened with open mouth. My jaw dropped when I heard this. What she said was that when her mother, who I knew as an old lady, was wandering like Little Red Riding Hood, I suppose. I don't know the circumstances. Maybe they came from the same village. I have no idea. And I'm not going to be able to find out now. But this old lady, as a young girl, knew the woodcutter. And the woodcutter, who was then a very old man in the very late 19th century, he would have been close to 100 too. He divulged the story to this young girl of how he escaped conscription into the Napoleonic army by hiding in his woodpile. And interestingly, this occurred in the forest while this old man was cutting wood. Obviously, a profession that he had engaged in all his working life, from a young boy to a very old man indeed. So maybe 80 years of wood chopping. And that story was then passed by the mother of my neighbour to her, and then she passed it to me. So I'll leave it there, but I just find it fascinating that I just want to say this. Just going back to the Napoleonic army and Napoleon himself. Although Napoleon was a very, very skilled planner and strategist with battles, his Achilles heel was lack of men, lack of conscripts. And so, given that there was such a desertion rate and such a reluctance to become a conscript, and no doubt people's natural ability to avoid being conscripted probably contributed. Well, it did contribute to a really difficult time in terms of conscription, which ultimately led to the abdication of Napoleon and his subsequent incarceration on the island of Elba. And my next door neighbour's acquaintance was one of those guys, probably back in 1812 or 1813 or 1814, one of those years when it was really difficult, perhaps. And I've always remembered this. The daughter is no longer with us, and I do wonder how many people know of this story. Maybe her immediate family, who knows, and perhaps it's been passed on. There may be an oral tradition in the family, but I was very grateful to my neighbour to share this amazing tale to me, and 40 years later I'm passing it on to you. Hopefully you'll pass it on to someone else. Thank you for listening. Bye for now.